Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate and discuss the importance of regional counterterrorism and counter-narcotics cooperation, which of course entails countering terrorist narratives. My special thanks to the India Foundation and especially to Director Ram Madhav, a great friend of Afghanistan, and his tireless team for organizing this very productive conference. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to the government and people of India for continued development and civilization support. And this connection, I would like to acknowledge the presence of India's former ambassador and a good friend of Afghanistan, Ambassador Amir Sana, who did so much to help build and deepen ties between our two nations, for which we remain grateful. And I'd like to discuss 3 points which His Excellency National Security Advisor Hanif Atmar discussed at the recent Kabul process meeting for peace and security cooperation. This meeting was attended by over 30 countries, including India and international organizations. They constitute the principal stakeholders in the Afghan peace process, and as well as in efforts to help stabilize Afghanistan as we jointly fight terrorism. First, a joint assessment and common understanding of the threat, and to dispel myths, some of which were discussed yesterday and today, and then the need for mutually reinforcing strategies to counter and defeat the threats, and as well as the need for regional coordinated peace and counterterrorism efforts, for which we made 7 proposals in the last meeting of the Kabul process for international and as well as regional cooperation and support. First, in the Afghan context, we understand and consider terrorism as a threat to national security interests, state security, and as well as economic interests. And we know that this is a threat not limited to Afghanistan, but to every country in the region, including Pakistan, and as well as the broader international community. And this threat, in our context, emanates from a lethal nexus of violent extremism by transnational terrorist networks, criminal economics by transnational criminal networks, and as well as covert state sponsorship. In the principal drivers of terrorism in the Afghan context include the Afghan insurgent networks, the Taliban and the Haqqani network, which provide an enabling environment, serve as an umbrella platform under which transnational terrorist networks have come together to destabilize Afghanistan, the region, and the world at large. And these include Al-Qaeda, Daesh, ISK, LET, TTP, IMU, or Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, and ETEM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement. And of course, transnational criminal networks, which include traffickers of drugs, humans, weapons, precursors. And the 3 have a symbiotic reinforcing relationship. If you consider the relationship among transnational terrorist networks, and then that between TTN and TCN, involving protection, sanctuaries, logistics, financing, and training, which were discussed yesterday and today, and I don't want to go into details. Unfortunately, from where we stand in the Afghan context and our surrounding region, this problem has only grown. The number of terrorists and transnational criminal networks and their capabilities have grown, and unfortunately it's increasingly centered in Afghanistan. And that's why we need to look at the situation based on facts, not so many myths that are propagated by state and non-state actors. In our context, the fact that the war in Afghanistan is not a civil war, it's global terrorism, it's a state sponsorship of terrorism, which of course was discussed in the last session, doesn't need any further clarification, and as well as organized crime, which then uses such an environment to drive the mass drug cultivation and production to meet the regional and global demand. If you think about how much drugs produced in Afghanistan cost is, estimates range from $60 billion to $350 billion. So in a sense, we are fighting with very scarce resources, let's say 60 to $350 billion illicit business, and that's why it's so challenging. Again, it was pointed out by panelists, let's really not associate Islam with terrorism. Of course, 99% of Afghans are Muslims, and yet we are the victims, and yet we are the fighters against this threat. And of course, have made the largest number of sacrifices, not Americans, not Indians, or Chinese, or others, but of course, Muslims themselves. We lost 10,000 Afghans last year, 10,000 just last year. If you look at the United Nations report, especially UNAMA's report, these include women, children, and so forth. And we also, Muslim countries, in this case Afghanistan, is effectively partnering with countries in the region and beyond to fight this. And so, no association. Islam is a religion of peace, tolerance, and coexistence. And no country has really exemplified that than India. And if you really look at the history of Sufism in this context, which was, of course, discussed this morning by Chishti Sharif, which is in Herat of Afghanistan, how Chishti Sharif migrated from Afghanistan, Western Afghanistan, to come to India with a message of peace, with a message of bringing different castes into equality, into harmony, into peace. And that's the message that we in this region, in South Asia, must use to fight extremism and terrorism. And of course, there should be no distinction between good and bad terrorism, as Pakistan makes, and I think it's already hurting them. Remember, a few years ago, there was no TTP, the Taliban of Pakistan. The fact that emerged because of this distinction, that we fight good Taliban, bad Taliban, we don't fight good Taliban, which they consider as their proxy in the Afghan context. And again, the fact that Afghanistan is really not just defending ourselves, but defending this region, defending India, defending Central Asia, by extension China and Russia and Europe and the rest in this global war against terrorism. My second point, therefore, is a need for mutually reinforcing strategies. And we discussed this in the recent Kabul process meeting, that on the one hand, we must pursue a peace strategy to separate the Taliban from transnational terrorist networks. And if they're denied sanctuaries in our immediate neighborhood, then we should be able to make a significant contribution to regional and global counterterrorism efforts. And at the same time, we should pursue a counterterrorism and counter-narcotics strategy, which, of course, should advance our peace efforts by increasing the number of reconcilable Taliban, because that would effectively pressure them into peace talks with us. And this too would bolster and contribute to regional and global counterterrorism campaign. And this brings me to the third point as a result for a need for regional coordinated peace and counterterrorism efforts, so long as such threats, such common threats, require common strategy. And then under this, we made 7 specific proposals, because oftentimes we get together in meetings and regional and global conference to discuss the threat, but no one really puts forward action plans, strategies, how to actually move forward and address the problem, as opposed to just talking about it and then forgetting about it. In Afghanistan, this time, we put forth 2 strategies, one for peace, and of course, which President Ghani made a comprehensive peace offer to the Taliban so that they come forward and talk peace to address the problem through a long-term sustainable political settlement, and as well as, of course, a counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism strategy. And of course, we propose that we should hold a regional conference to agree on such strategies and coordination. Under our obligations, existing obligations, and under existing mechanisms of cooperation, and we're not short of those. Under any mechanism that you see, from SARC to Shanghai Organization cooperation to, of course, United Nations global counterterrorism, which is an elaborate definition, and of course the steps that we need to take to fight. Second, at the same time, an action plan that we need to adopt for implementation with our Islamic partners, especially Saudi-led Islamic military coalition in the fight against terrorism, through which we must share intelligence to deal with foreign fighters in Afghanistan, and as well as action against financing and counter-terrorist ideology, and as well as support for the Afghan National Security Forces, including our army and police. At the same time, we'd like to sign bilateral counterterrorism and counter-narcotics agreements with all of our neighbors, besides a regional approach, and as well as negotiating extradition agreements for prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of foreign fighters and their families arrested in Afghanistan. We have already extradited 87 terrorists to 5 countries, and we're in the process of extraditing another 73 foreign fighters, terrorists, to 4 other countries. As most of those countries, I think all of them were present in the recent Kabul process meeting. We have also proposed a joint review of foreign fighters to trace the movement, their movement, and to identify their support infrastructure as a response. Because we're hearing allegations of how some of our partners are facilitating the expansion of Daesh's threat in Afghanistan, or do movement from one region to another, which we utterly reject. And that's why in this meeting, the NSA offered a joint review to some countries which allege that such issues are going on in Afghanistan. And as well as a joint review of terrorist financing. And lastly, we recently appreciated the initiative by the Indonesian government to invite scholars from Afghanistan and Pakistan to get together and meet in Indonesia later this month to organize a process of public education and issue fatwas to reject the hate ideology of terrorists, and as well as their terror campaign in Afghanistan. So with that, I keep it short, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.